I've read nearly 40 Stephen King books now, and Mr. Mercedes is a little bit outside of his wheelhouse, I would say, from what I'm used to from Stephen King. Obviously, I've read 40 of his books, which means that I've also not read 40 of his other books. But from the ones I've read, this one is a lot more inside the box of reality that I'm personally used to getting from a Stephen King novel. I do sort of think the notion or like the idea that Stephen King is strictly a horror author is very often overplayed. I think he's got tons of books that are not horror, that are very obviously not horror. But regardless of that, he does still most of the time write about like the supernatural, fantastical, that sort of thing, monsters, whatever. I think one of the reasons Mr. Mercedes is interesting to me is because it doesn't have any of that. It is in a totally prosaic, normal universe. It doesn't have anything supernatural happening. It's basically just like a really solid, somewhat conventional true crime, cat and mouse kind of detective noir story. And it's honestly pretty fun to read what is otherwise a very Stephen King voiced story through that lens. Technically not the first time I would say that I've read a story like this or like similar to the plot of this. I think a lot of the story beats in Mr. Mercedes ring pretty similar to Black House. But that book was co-authored by Peter Straub, and I think that his influence as a writer is just kind of all over the thing, strictly in terms of like the prose of the book and how the writing sounds. Mr. Mercedes is like, it sounds and it feels like a Stephen King voiced story. Like if you've read a lot of Stephen King books, he's got sort of a particular style just of writing, of phrasing things. The way his books read is just kind of distinct, I guess. And so I guess this is the first, what I'm trying to say is like this is the first Stephen King book I've read that's like a crime story. So it's a little bit out of his wheelhouse, I would say, for that, like for the genre, but it's also a little bit outside his wheelhouse, I think, on like a deeper, more structural level, which is that while I generally consider King's character writing to be his strongest attribute as a writer, like he's really able to get into the interiority of his characters in a way that a lot of other authors I've read don't do in the same way. But Mr. Mercedes is focused much more heavily on plot. And that's not a dig, really. Mr. Mercedes has a really good plot. Like I mentioned earlier, it's basically just like a big cat and mouse game between retired detective Bill Hodges and fucked up psychopath Brady Hartsfield, Mr. Mercedes, the guy who committed the crime, who in one of the most fucked up opening chapters, probably of any Stephen King book, drives a Mercedes through a line of like job seekers at this job fair, which is of course described in acute, extremely upsetting, horrific detail. Bill Hodges to me is not a particularly compelling protagonist, but he's like a nice enough guy, and his motivation for going on this wild goose chase in the first place makes sense from a story level. Basically, Brady Hartsfield is like the one who got away before he retired. He was never able to catch him, and he's got a lot of guilt about that, and then he's also got a lot of guilt about the way that they, like him and his partner, handled the original investigation before he retired. So he's just sort of got a lot of baggage about the whole thing, and that does add some decent depth to his motivations as a character, to the actions he takes. Like, he is a logical character. I don't think he's super interesting as a person, but he's a fine protagonist. He's just kind of like this grumpy old cop archetype. He's decently clever, he's decently witty, he's got some good relationships throughout the book. I would say he kind of has this boyfriend-girlfriend relationship with Janie, who's the cousin of Olivia Trelawney, which is the woman whose Mercedes got stolen in the first place. And their relationship it's nice enough. It's a little bit hard for me to buy at certain points, like why Janie would even be into Bill Hodges, but like besides my, I can't really suspend my disbelief for some of that stuff. Like, their relationship is written fine, and then He's got a decent relationship with Jerome Robinson. It's like his neighbor boy who kind of helps him out with chores and stuff around the house. They got a nice little friendship going on, although, I mean, I sort of have to bring up the whole Jerome AAVE patois thing that he constantly does throughout the book. It's extremely obnoxious and grating, and it's so frequent throughout the book. Like, he does it so much that after a certain point, I'm like, holy shit, please, Stephen King, please stop. Please stop doing this. I get what he's trying to do. He's trying to, like, subvert the stereotype that people who talk that way can't be intelligent and have a lot of agency and stuff. Like, I understand what he's trying to do technically, but he doesn't really do a good job of doing it, and it's just really annoying. I don't know, this is really annoying. So yeah, well, I'd say that some of these characters aren't as, like, enthralling and as, I guess, deep as other staple Stephen King characters. They're also not terrible. They're enough to drive the plot forward, and that, to me, like, the plot is where the majority of the fun is with this book anyway. The main exceptions to this, I would say, are Holly Gibney, who I think is very eccentric in a way that is interesting. I'm excited to see why she is apparently such a staple character in the King Mr. Mercedes multiverse going forward. I know that she's in all the rest of the books, and I know that she's a character in other books, and I know that she's got her own book, so I'm interested to see what the deal with that is. Like, in Mr. Mercedes, she's a relatively minor character, and like I said, she's pretty, like, wacky and weird and eccentric, and she's probably one of the more interesting characters in the book. But again, she's a pretty minor character, so it's hard to really glean exactly where he's, like, planning on going with that. But the most interesting character in the book to me, by far, is Brady Hartsfield, aka Mr. Mercedes, the titular Mr. Mercedes. Just an insanely fucked up guy. Just really, really deranged and evil, and, like, he's a part of so many upsetting chapters and sequences and moments. He gets a lot of POV chapters in this book. A lot of it takes place from his perspective, which I think on one hand does take some of the mystery element out of the story, because you know what the main antagonist is doing at all times, so there's never any suspense necessarily in, like, what his plans are or what he's intending to do. But the payoff for that is that you get all this internal monologue from him, and you get his entire thought process in the way that his mind works, and it's just extremely fucked up and extremely upsetting, and the way that Stephen King paints this man is just a really, really detailed in a way that's not, like, fun or good. Just to spoil a couple of chapters specifically that I thought were, like, particularly upsetting is one, there's the chapter where Brady poisons some hamburger meat with the intention of feeding it to Jerome's pet dog to kill it. But he leaves it in a cooler in his garage, and then his mom comes home before him and eats the poison hamburger meat. So then Brady comes home a couple hours later to find his mom excruciatingly dying from poison. I won't go into any more detail than that, but just, like, that whole sequence of events slowly unfolding, and just the meticulous detail Stephen King uses to describe somebody dying of poison in that way, extremely upsetting. Again, upsetting. There's also a really more sad chapter of the backstory of Brady's little brother and the way that he tragically passed away. It's, like, one of the longest chapters in the book. Also really fucked up. I do like how King, this is just a general Stephen King thing, where he'll just, like, find some really particular detail of the story and just zoom in on it really far. And so it's cool to see him do it again in this book, and do it with a character who is just so messed up in the head. Like, he really just puts you in there. So yeah, Brady is great villain. He's a great counterpoint to this sort of unassuming protagonists and the rest of the characters that populate the book, who to me aren't super, super interesting in a way a lot of King characters are. Brady kind of, like, sets the mark for that in this book. I won't get too much into the details of the plot beyond that. I think the book is paced extremely well. There's a lot of fun, like, surprises, a lot of misdirections. I mentioned earlier how having Brady as a POV character does kind of take away some of the suspense, but despite that, he was still able to put a couple punches in there, just like kind of catch you off guard with a few things. Also, the book is extremely readable. I'm a slow reader. I cannot power through a book in like a couple days like some people, but I finished this book pretty fast by my standards. I read it a lot quicker than I do most other books. And so yeah, I think it's pretty good. The only other like consistent nitpick I would really want to get off my chest is just the way that King talks about technology in this book gets kind of grating after a while. You can just kind of tell he's like an old man. You can just kind of tell it's an old man writing this book, especially like an old man in the year 2014, which is when this book was released. Just the way he describes cell phones and websites and like tech companies, it just, you can tell he's a little out of his depth with some of that material. And it's particularly unfortunate in this case because technology as a whole is sort of integral to the plot of the book, like with the Under Debbie's Blue Umbrella website and the fact that Brady literally works for like a computer tech company. It just, some of that stuff wasn't written about in the most smooth way, I would say. But again, that's a pretty minor nitpick. Overall, I did really enjoy this book. I thought it was very solid. It's probably not in the upper echelon of my favorite King stories, but it's solid, it's good, it's a good crime story, it keeps you on the edge of your seat, it's a page turner, and it leaves the door open enough at the end that I'm totally interested in reading the sequels. So yeah, I'll give this book 7 out of 10 Mercedes. Let me know what you think if you've read this book or don't.